Since we have loaded the 3D model, we need to continue using Fusion's 3D tools to get our solution. So I'm just going to select these two groups and move them over here. And we're going to start building a 3D setup here for our FBX file so it renders properly. The first thing we have to do is we have to set a material for this. At the moment, as you can see, it's just got the default diffuse material on, and this is because that's embedded in the FBX file. We are going to override this with our own material made up from the bitmaps that we see here. What we're going to do is we're going to be using a specific shader, material shader, to get the look that we want. There's one shader we need to use because we need to use a normal map, and not all the shaders support the input of a normal map, so we're going to use a thing called a Cook Torrents shader. So instead of using the set tools, I'm not sure quite where it lives, so I'm going to right click and go add tool. It's going to be under 3D, that's for certain, and here we are. There was a material section under here, and as you can see right over here we have this one called Cook Torrents. So let's do that. And Cook Torrents has a number of inputs, so let's just move our FBX mesh over here. If we hover over them, we'll see that this one is expecting a diffuse color, which will be our main color map you can see here. We then have the green one, which is expecting a specular color. We then have a bump map, which will be our normal map, will go in there. We then have a refractive index. We have a specular intensity, and finally we have a roughness material. Now we're not going to be using all of those, we're just going to be using the ones that we have maps for. And so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to put in the diffuse. Not a lot's going to look like it's going to happen, because first off, when we do this we need to actually hook it up to our FBX. But if I just put this into the Cook Torrents, if I send this into the main viewer, you'll see it'll look very strange. And that's because it's just the shader that we're looking at here. So what we need to do is we need to pipe this into the material input, which is this green one on the FBX node, and that will override the material that's currently on the FBX file. So let's now put the FBX file into viewer 1, and there we are. So now you can see it looks a bit different now with the base diffuse in there with no lighting, but that's what it currently looks like. If we want to see it shaded, we can turn on shading, so let's do that. Now you can see that with its shading it's going to look quite strange because we haven't got any lights in the scene, and we do need some lighting really for this to work properly. So let's do that. Let's bring some lights together. To do that we're going to need to have a light source and then a merge 3D node to bring everything together into one environment. Let's do space. I'm going to type light, and the one I want, I'm going to use a point light. I find that easiest just to maneuver around. So here is our point light. It's not going to do anything at the moment because it's not hooked into anything. It's just kind of floating. And now we need a merge. We are not going to see anything, of course, unless we actually view the output of the merge. So let's do that. Select merge 3D, send that to viewer, and suddenly you can see the lighting now being affected by our point light. So we can now move this around. As you can see, we're affecting the lighting of our asset. We can also do things like we can play around with the intensity and things like that. So once we've got the angle you want, then you can select the point light. You see we've got an intensity slider over here, and we can play around with that to kind of get the lighting balance that we basically want. So for example, I come in here, type 5, a bit overkill, then drop it back. You can see we can play around. Okay, so we have our initial setup, so we can now see that we have our 3D asset. Now if the grid's annoying you, you can actually hide the grid, of course, so that's one of the things you can do. So if you find that you can now if the grid's annoying, you can of course hide the grid if it's getting in the way. Once it's done its job for you, then you can just simply right click in the 3D viewport and under, where are we? There we are, 3D options, grid, turn off. There we are, so now it's a little less in the way. Okay, so we have our object, so let's get the others wired in. So what we have now, as you can see, is we have nothing more than a diffuse map. We have our normal, we have our specular, ambient occlusion and alpha to deal with. So let's do the normal map next. So I'm just going to bring that up here. Now you might think you could just pump the normal map straight in to the comp here. So actually, and while I'm at it, by the way, I'm just going to do a Control S, and I'm just doing a version. Always a good thing to do. So you might think, well, why don't we just plug it straight in? So let's find our normal input, which is one of these. Okay, that's that one. You notice it's bump map material, so if we pump that straight in, it's not going to go. You see, it won't connect, and the reason it won't connect is because it's the wrong type of map. It's a normal map, and this is expecting a kind of black and white height map input. So we need to use a conversion node to get this into the right format for the Cook Torrent shader. So let's click off and do Control Space, and what I'm looking for is something that has normal in it. Okay, or not. Let's try map. Ah, there we are. Yes, it's not called normal, it's called bump map node. So there it is, it's the bump map node, and we go OK, and this will do the conversion for us. So we plump the normal into the bump map node, and then we pump that into our node here. So just check we've got the right one. So in it goes. Now you'll see it connects, but it doesn't look like anything's happened, and there is actually a reason for that. If we click on the actual bump map itself, it needs to know what type of conversion that we actually want. At the moment it's expecting height information. You see it's set to luminance, so what it's really expecting is expecting a grayscale map coming in, so it can turn it into, into data that the Cook Torrents node understands. Well, this is actually an actual normal map, and you'll notice that there's a height map here and a bump map, and this is the normal map. It's confusing because Fusion refers to it as a bump map, and for everybody else in the world, a bump map is a black and white height map. You can see it says height map here. So, but this is the Fusion version of a normal map. So we actually click on that, and immediately we do that. Notice what in the viewport the change. So with the incorrect setting, and then with the correct setting, suddenly you can now see the normal map actually working rather beautifully, in fact. So there we go. It's rather nice, isn't it? Okay, so there we are. So what we've got now is we have our normal map in doing its thing. The next thing I want to do is look at, let's bring the specular in. So this is going to deal with the specular sheen on the surface. Now we can just generally work with the specular by selecting the Cook Torrents node itself and looking at its controls. And you'll see that there's a specular spinner. We bring that down. We actually have specular intensity in. Not lots happening, and the reason for that is that the roughness is quite high. So if I drop the roughness down, you can see it becomes very glossy, and that of course is when the specular highlight becomes effective. There it is there. So this is a global setting, the specular. So this is now sort of like a wet skin. But that's a global setting. What we actually have here, if we have a look at it, and let's put this into the second viewport, is we have what's called a specular map. So this map is being used, the grayscale, to control how shiny and unshiny, or how specular and unspecular certain bits of this surface is. So what we need to do is plug that in, and we want specular intensity for this. So let's see, it's one of these, refractive index. There it is, the pink one. So let's move it up here. I'm going to plug that in, and now this is going in. It doesn't look like a lot is actually happening, and there's actually a kind of a reason for that. If we read. This is where the manual's really important, because this confused the hell out of me. I plug it in, and as you can see, nothing happened. And I, played around with the sliders, and it became obvious that this was just the global setting working all the time, and the specular map here was doing absolutely nothing. So the question was, why was it doing nothing? So I went to the manual, so good old help. Now the manual, of course, this is the main user manual, and what we actually want to be looking at is what's called the tools manual. So I have that in my recent files somewhere. There it is. So let's open that, and let's drop down and have a look. So let's see what we're looking for. We are looking for the Cook torrents, which is a material. So let's go back. Page 1. Material tools. Cook torrents. Right, let's see what it says. So let's just zoom in a bit. Cook torrents, specular intensity texture. It says this input will accept a 2D image or a 3D material. The intensity map for the material's specular highlights. When the input is a 2D image, the alpha channel is used to create the map, while the color channels remain discarded. Really, really useful. I don't know why it can't use the the RGB channels, but apparently it can't. It uses the alpha channel. Right. So now we know what the problem is. The problem is that it could be the alpha channel. So let's have a look at the alpha. And yes, sure enough, there is no alpha. You can see it's just completely blank, and that's why nothing's happening on the 3D object. So we need to fix that. We need to actually take this black and white information that's in the RGB channels, and we need to push it into the alpha channel of this bitmap. And the way we have to do that, or the only way we can do that, is using a thing called the channel boolean. So control spacebar, start typing channel, and here it is. We don't want the 3 bar one, we want the 2, but we want the single channel booleans. And there we are. So we have this one called channel boolean. Now if we look over here on the right hand side now, this is the control panel for it. And you can see it says 2 alpha, and it's looking at the alpha channel, which of course there is absolutely zip all in. What we need to do is we need to copy any one of these into the alpha channel. So typically green has the most information in. We can check that because on here you can see we can look at red component of the image. That's red. This is going to be green. There's not a lot of difference, by the way. It looks like the same data is in every single channel, which kind of makes sense considering how it's just created. We want red from here, looking at the output of the channel boolean. So let's just select that. 2 to put that in. So there. So if I turn that off again, you'll see the difference. Do nothing. We get our original blank alpha, and take the output of the red channel and put it into the alpha. And we get a copy, and now the alpha channel has something in it. And we actually see the change over here immediately. I don't know if you noticed that. We can do that by just disabling the Boolean operator by doing Control P. So here you can clearly see the global specular, and if I re-enable the channel Boolean, that is now our specular map working on our object. And if we rotate around, you can see it's quite a subtle kind of sort of specular effect we're getting there, which is maybe what we want, maybe not. There's a way to deal with that if we decide we want to boost it a bit, and the way to do that is just to add in a grade before here. So what I'm going to do is just put some curves in. So here is the specular, which we can see the output of, and it's adding a curve controls. And what we can do now is just, you can see now we're boosting it, and you can see the effect it's having in the 3D viewport. I mean, obviously you don't want to overdo this sort of thing. You don't want to lose the detail. And there we are, so we've boosted the kind of specular, so it's a bit more kind of wet, a bit more glossy, maybe what you want or not want. So this gives you a level of control now. You can change this at any point or disable it. So what we have now is we have our normal map going in, we have our specular map going in through a curves control and a Boolean operator that's basically copying into the right channel so that it actually works for the shader. Yes, now we need to move on to the next one. What we have left is we have the ambient occlusion and we have the alpha, but we'll deal with the ambient occlusion first. Now the ambient occlusion is often used in the trade as a kind of dirt map in a way. It's a kind of way of adding kind of dirt detail to an object, and we can have a look at it. So let's just look at it in the 2D in the second viewer. So now the reason that's not working is because that's the alpha channel, so let's switch back to colour. And as you can see, there it is. It's a black and white kind of map, like a sort of the occlusion of the object. So it's often used, as I said, as a dirt pass, just add a little bit of kind of sort of dirt into crevices and stuff where you have kind of sunken detail like this. Let's add this. And what we're going to do is we're going to add this to the colour. We need to add this to the diffuse, which is here, because we need to overlay it on top of it and blend it in, because it's not something that gets plugged directly into the shader. It's something that's going to be added on top of the original colour map and blended to our liking. So to do that, I am simply going to merge it by dropping it on the output of this one. That'll automatically create a merge node. Immediately you can see it. It's well and truly in force. You can see here taking over. And what we can do now to control its level is we need to change to what's called the blend mode. At the moment, it's the wrong kind of mode really. It's just completely obliterating everything. But the merge node, as you know, has an apply mode, and it defaults to normal. But when it comes to ambient occlusion maps, the way you add them or merge them on is you multiply them with the previous input. So if we multiply now, you'll see all our original colours come back, and now we've just got the darker parts of the ambient occlusion map overlaid on top of our original colour information. And it's still heavy, but we can deal with that, because now all we need to do is go to the blend part of the blend controls in the merge node, and we can dial it in and out. So that's none whatsoever. And then we can just bring it in to a level where we think it's just subtle. See the skin pores and stuff like that. So again, this is going to be entirely down to personal taste, and also down to how it blends in with the object that we're going to be sticking the scar on, of course. Right, so there we are. So we're almost there. I mean, we've now got our base shader set up. I'm just going to do a Control S to save. Everything's set up apart from the alpha. So what are we going to do with this? This is if we look at this, I'm going to send this into second viewer. This is obviously a mask designed to trim away parts of this 3D object we don't want. What we need to do to use this is we need to plumb it in, not to the shader, but we need to plug it into every single bitmap input here, because it's obviously designed as a 2K map that perfectly matches all the other maps. And as you can see, each image has a mask input. Now we can't directly input it, because if I come here, say to the diffuse, and I plug it in, it'll connect, but nothing happens. And the reason for that, again, is the same thing as before. This is a black and white bitmap, and the mask input is expecting an alpha channel. So we need to use the bitmap node here. So with it selected, I'm just going to do Control Spacebar, type in, that's better. And it's this one that we want to disconnect. It always connects. I should remember never to do that. We take the output of that into there, and then this one goes in to there. And now, of course, nothing's happened because we haven't told the bitmap node what we want. We want it to base the alpha on the luminance value, because it's a black and white image. So as soon as we do that, bingo, there you go. You can see that we now have our mask. Now, the reason it looks odd is because it has to be on every single one of these. Well, not every single one, as you'll see, but it has to be on all of these other nodes, because it's only on one at the moment, the diffuse one. So what we need to do is we need to take the bitmap itself, because we only want this once. We take this one and we put it into the AO, And that will trim the AO map. You can see the effect there. We'll do the same with the specular. But we're not going to do it to the normal map. It won't work with the normal map. The normal map is a special kind of map, so we don't need to trim that in any way because of what it's doing for the shader and how it works with the shader. So there we are. We've now effectively trimmed our 3D object with the alpha, and we can spin around it, and there we are. We have a floating scar with a really nice soft edge. You can see all the specular highlights and stuff. Once we have it in the scene and we can see what angle the light's at, we can just move the light around to match our live action plate and get something that's kind of sympathetic basically to the shot. Okay, so I think that's pretty good. What we do now is we need to save this, of course, Control S. Do a little bit of admin tidy up because we've got our two nice little boxes down here, and we've kind of created this, but it's a little bit messy. So let's do a little bit of tidying up on it, just to try and make it look a bit decent. Okay, so that's Mesh 3D. Now with these you can always use, I like quite using these little breaks. Alt lets you add in these kind of little breakpoints, which I find quite handy at times. Right, so that goes there. That goes there. I'm being a bit pedantic, but I just like to have things so I know kind of where everything is. Make it as visual as possible so I can see, you know, all the wiring properly without too many wires crossing behind things. You can sometimes get confused if you kind of have a lot of wires that go behind some things. You can't quite see where they've come from or where they're going to, so I tend to kind of just make sure that they are you know, not crossing each other. Okay, so there we are. We have our setup. So let's get an underlay for it. So I'm just going to click off here and type underlay and F2 to rename it. And I'm going to call this Scar 3D Creation. There we go. And move it over here, grab the bottom right, move it down there, so something like this will work well. Click off. Now there we are, our solution is in a box that we can shift around and continue working. Right, to move on, it's time to connect our 3D solution up to the rest of our composite. So I'm just going to slide this over here a bit to make room for the new nodes. And before I go too far, I will just zoom in here. I'm just going to make an adjustment to the corner pin because it's not quite plain out of the surface. It's fine for testing purposes, but I'm going to select the track, and here is our corner pin box. And I'm going to turn on high quality for this, so I just want to see what I'm doing without all the aliasing issues. This forehead is sort of a bit more. Think of this as a window into which we're going to be placing our scar, which we're going to basically be rendering. Go. I'll try something like that. Maybe just bring it up a bit. See what that looks like at the beginning. Well, sorry, at the end of the shot. Set it cache up there. It takes a little while because it has to render all of that. Control scroll, we'll just zoom back out a bit. As I said, this is very much going to be used as kind of a window to place our scar in. Okay, that looks pretty good to me, so let's click off of that. And I'm just going to fit that back for the moment. Okay, to get our object in here, we need to replace the UV grid with a render of this 3D view here. So we have our 3D model when we have our lights and everything, but at the moment, you know, it's just in a 3D world all on its own. We need to get it into a 2D format so that we can use the corner pin data to place it on the forehead of the actor. To do that, I need a render 3D node, so I'm going to come down here and select the merge node, which is our last node in this creation box, and up here for the shortcut, rather than go looking for it, you can see there's a icon here, so I'm going to click on that. So that gets us render 3D node, and this will now give us a 2D render of this. So now this won't actually work, because if I send this over here, you'll see that you'll see it all looks a bit strange. It's filled frame and we're super zoomed in and all that. That's because we don't have a camera. You know, you need a camera for the 3D render to work properly or be rendered into 2D space. Let's make ourselves a camera, or get a camera. Again, there's an icon up here for that. So I'm just going to click off here, and we can actually select the merge node and go cam 3D. Automatically hooks the camera up for us. There we are. As you can see, we lose this image over here, and that's because the camera currently, if we look over here, is at world 0, and it's right in the middle of the sky. In fact, it's slightly behind it because it's bent, so it's not actually seeing anything. So as soon as we pull it back, we should get something, and there we are. So now we are seeing our image. I could pull the camera a long way back, but what I'm going to do instead is I'm actually going to change the focal length so I can fill this into the frame. So with the camera selected, the properties panel over here, I'm going to change the angle of view and give ourselves a wide angle lens. There we go. It's angle of view. You can also do the focal length by reducing the focal length down. Now we can see the transparency of the alpha channel. Now the thing to note here is the original scar is rectangular, and by that what I mean is if I come down here and I select our diffuse image and I send that to viewer 1 temporarily, you can see that it was a 2048 by 2048 square render, and we want to mimic that because don't forget the UV grid is also square. So we have a look at that. That is equally square, and it is being mapped, you know, from that square onto there. So we need to kind of keep that relationship going, otherwise we're going to get distortions going on and we're going to have to compensate, and it's much easier to see things fit properly if we have everything up the pipe that is set properly. Go back to looking at our output there. Again, I'm going to put merge 3D into viewer 1, and we want to change this output. You can see this is 1280/720, and if we select the render 3D node, you can see we come to image tab here, and indeed it is, you know, the 1280/720 format of our project. So this we want to change. We want to mimic the resolution of that bitmap we just saw. So we need to change this to 2048. Tab key and 2048, and there we are. So that is now a square render. If we fit that, you'll see that if we pull back out one more time, control scroll wheel, you'll see we have a 2048 render that mimics the one over here. So what I'm going to do is, just to make sure everything matches, I'm going to put this in here, and I'm going to fit this, and then I'm going to move the camera back so that we get a similar kind of relationship between the two. So I'm going to select the camera now. Obviously I can manipulate the camera in the 3D view, but I need to be able to see it to do that, and I want to see these two images. But I can of course go to the control panel over here, and I can equally manipulate the camera over here, and here is the Z axis, so I can just simply move the camera back this way, and there we are. We're now getting our scar moving in that window. And of course with that we can do all sorts of things. We can, for example, manipulate the 3D model so that we get a different, rotation and things like that the camera's actually seeing. To do that, we probably want to put a 3D transform node into our setup over here, because we can go to the FBX mesh, for example, which is obviously this object here. In fact, if I select the merge 3D node and hit 1 to put that in here, just control scroll to zoom back out and scroll wheel to pan, so we can see everything here. And here is our object, and of course it's got a manipulator, and we can manipulate it either with the merge 3D node. We can manipulate it with the actual mesh itself, because the mesh itself, as you can see, has a lot of controls, manipulator controls for it. However, I always prefer to try and avoid manipulating the initial mesh. It's more flexible to put a transform node upstream of it, because then that way if something goes wrong or you don't like what you've done, you can simply disable or delete that transform node. So let's make ourselves some space to do that. So I'm just going to shift this up here, and what we need now is a 3D transform. So control spacebar, and I'm going to type in transform, and there we go. We've got transform 3D. That's the one we want. Since we're in 3D space, we want 3D transform. And now we have a 3D transform node, and it's sitting right on top of the one that's over there. And as you can see, we can simply grab it, and we've got the ability now to slide and move around our object. We can also rotate it, and that's quite handy if we want to sort of match up the perspective a bit of the curvature, because obviously this here has a little bit of curvature to it, and if we want to kind of maybe rotate it a bit, we can either do that in this viewport here by switching to the rotation tool. So now you can see we're able to rotate the object. Just control Z that. Or we can, of course, and of course the other thing we can do if we need to is we can roll it, which is very useful, which we'll be using in a bit in a moment. But the other thing, of course, we can do is we can do it over here as well. So we can quite happily come down here and use these tools as well. Okay, so with that said, let's get these together. So here's our render, and this is what we're going to be outputting, and this is now going to be placed on the forehead of the actor. So where we have our UV grid going in over here, we can simply just attach it in. So I'm just going to bring this down, just get that out of the way. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'll put the edit up here, I'll put the track here, I'm going to feed this in. Okay, so now when we feed this to viewer 2, there we are, we have our scar on the forehead of our actor. So let's bring it up to 100% so we can see it. Okay, so it's a bit small of course, but this is the whole point of what I was saying about making a corner pin window into which we are going to put the scar. So we have our corner pin already set up, and we don't want to change that too much more in case we go off the edge of this, but we can do that if we need to. So what I'm going to do is we can now use this transform tool to position the scar where we want it. So let's do that. Let's maybe bring it down a bit, and let's bring it across a bit, like so. Definitely think it wants to be somewhat larger, so scale wise, And you can do the scaling over here, but equally you can come down here and see we've got a scale. If you want to do fine scaling, don't forget hold the control key down as you drag, and that will give you much finer control. So now you can see we can scale up, and if you can't scale up far enough, you can always just type in a much bigger value here. Now you can see we're hitting the edge now, so we're scaling up to the point where we're clipping the edge of the corner pin, but we don't want to go off the edge of the forehead anyway, because obviously that wouldn't make sense. So it's just a case of figuring out where we want to place the scar. The other thing I might want to do is just rotate it a bit, so we can just bring it like this maybe. And the other thing I'm noting here as I'm doing this is the alpha channel that's controlling the fade off, the alpha channel that's clipping our scar is kind of blending it maybe a bit too much, depending on your feeling down here. See, it's clipping off and sort of disappearing. It may be that we'll replace this alpha mask with, this bitmap alpha mask with a actual spline based mask inside of Fusion. But for the moment, there we go, we've got a scar positioned. There's no color grading on it, so it doesn't sit in very well at all at the moment. So we need to fix that. Let's just come up here and just sort it out a bit more. Again, you can see we're sort of hitting the edge of the corner pin here. Anytime that something like that happens, we can actually obviously just alter the corner pin. So if we come to the planar track, you can see we can simply move the corner pin down to sort of something like this, and then we can reposition the scar, let ourselves get a bit further down towards the brow. So again, let's come back to the transform node and pull it back up, compensate. There we go. So we can do stuff like that. And I think I'll scale it a bit more, so let's just, again you can see we're hitting this side over here. Again, we can come back to the planar track node and bring that sort of out a bit more and compensate the scar back. Clicked off there, be very careful you don't get the right object. Sometimes it's hard to see the gizmos. Maybe something like this. This is where I might want to change the mask, because you see the mask is clipping here, and that's this soft edge here, and it may be that we want a tighter control over the mask with a spline, and I think maybe that's kind of what I'm going to do now, to get more control over where the scar is. The other thing is we need to look at the lighting, of course, because at the moment, as we can see, go in, you might want to match the lighting up a bit better. So let's just zoom out over here, grab our light source. Now you'll notice that nothing happened there, and the reason for that is we didn't turn the lighting on in the render, and you have to kind of do that. So if we come down to the render 3D node, let's go and have a look at the controls for it, and you'll see that there's no lighting enabled for it, which is the default. So we need to turn that on, and there we go. Now we're actually getting the lighting, which we were before, so that would have not helped at the end of the day if we had gone much further. But now, as you can see, we're able to move around, and we've got a much nicer looking scar. And we're looking to match the lighting that's in the scene, because the lighting is on the left here in the scene, which we can quite clearly see. So we just need to make sure that the angle of our light is sympathetic to that. It's a point light, so it'll have a round decay fall off, so you might want to pull it back a bit just to make it fill out a bit better, sort of somewhere back here, so it's lighting more evenly. But I just like the flexibility of a point light, because a spotlight has more parameters than a cone, and it's much more difficult to aim, whereas this you can just shift around, which I find is much easier to kind of work with. And of course we're going to be using some color balancing as well to make this sit in a lot better. Okay, next up, I think what we'll do is we'll look at sort of adding a spline in, but for now this is a kind of good position to be in. I'm actually going to version up this scene now, so I'm going to come up here and I'm going to do save version, so that pushes us up to version 5, and we'll look at the next tweak.